Hey, we're glad you could join us for another Contending for the Nation podcast. The day is dawning on another July 4th here in Wyoming. We're going to share about our godly heritage. We're going to talk about the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, the price that they paid. Were they oppressors, like many on the left are calling them? Oppressors, terrorists? Or were they servants that gave us a great land? Why do so many people want to come to America? Has a lot to do with the price that they paid and the freedom that they brought to America that's lasted so long. If we forget our godly heritage, disaster follows.
"56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. 56 men signed a document guaranteeing our right to pursue our happiness." What sort of men were these? 24 were judges and lawyers. 9 were farmers and plantation owners. 11 were merchants. The remaining 12 were doctors, ministers, and politicians. Well-educated men of means, knowing full well that signing such a document would mean certain death if captured.
Fire! Prime and low!
These 56 men sacrificed everything to ensure our freedom. 5 were tortured and subsequently died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 9 died fighting the Revolutionary War. Signer and New York delegate Francis Lewis was born in Wales, the only child of a clergyman and orphaned at an early age. His signature proved costly indeed. Francis Lewis saw his home plundered and properties destroyed. The enemy incarcerated his wife, and she died months later. Signer Carter Braxton, born in Virginia, invested much of his wealth as a successful planter and trader into the revolutionary cause. The British destroyed his private fleet as well as a number of his plantations. After selling his home and remaining possessions to pay his debts, Carter Braxton died in rags. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were men of courage. Men such as signer Thomas McKean, born in Pennsylvania in 1734. Continually hounded by enemy pursuers, Thomas was forced to move his family on a constant basis. He served in Congress without pay. His reward? A family kept in hiding, his possessions taken away, a life in abject poverty. Signer John Hart was a highly successful New Jersey farmer. He served as a justice of the peace and a member of the New Jersey Assembly. Later, John Hart became a delegate to the Continental Congress. After being driven from his dying wife's bedside, his 13 children having fled for their lives, John Hart lived in the woods and forest caves for over a year. He returned home only to find his wife dead and his children vanished. Weeks later, John Hart died from exhaustion and a broken spirit. Signers Philip Livingston and Lewis Morris experienced similar fates. And then there's the remarkable story of signer Thomas Nelson, Jr. Thomas Nelson, Jr. lived his life before the war as a Virginia planter, soldier, and statesman. His home was abruptly taken by British General Cornwallis for use as headquarters during the Battle of Yorktown. Governor Nelson became incensed as American guns would not engage. "Why do you spare my home?" he decried. Their response, "Sir, out of respect for you." Frustrated, Nelson demanded, "Give me the cannon," then proceeded to destroy the palatial residence himself. Yet this was not the end of his heroic sacrifice. Nelson raised $2 million, pledging his own estates to support the revolutionary cause. His property was forfeited when a peacetime Congress refused to honor that debt. Thomas Nelson Jr. died a few years later, bankrupt at age 50. Thomas Nelson Jr. wasn't alone, as soldiers and vandals ransacked and pilfered the homes of signers Clymer, Ellery, Gwinnett, Hall, Hayward, Middleton, Rutledge, and Walton.
As darkness permeates our nation, seeking to erase our godly heritage, we resist the lies and censorship, and we passionately pursue truth and the one who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." You're watching Contending for the Nation with Mark Anderson.
Glad you could be with us today. As you could see, those 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, many of them pastors involved in the clergy, very godly men that really stood for Christ and stood for freedom. They paid the ultimate sacrifice. Many of them were wealthy, and yet they lost everything, many of them, and lost their family, their life, just to give us freedom. See, we need to make sure we never forget our godly heritage, or the next thing that happens is disaster follows. The Old Testament, the Bible's full of stories when Israel forgot their God, forgot their covenant, and things just began to fall apart. Enemies came in and defeated them, and we're at a tipping point right now. It's not something we take lightly. Let me read this scripture. My friend Ted Kennedy sent me this scripture in Galatians 5:13 through 15, and it's in the Message. It is absolutely clear that God has called you to a free life. Just make sure that you don't use your freedom as an excuse to do whatever you want to do and destroy your freedom. Rather, use your freedom to serve one another in love. That's how freedom grows. For everything we know about God's Word is summed up in a single sentence: love others as you love yourself. That's an act of true freedom. If you bite and ravage each other, watch out. In no time at all, you'll be annihilating each other, and where will your precious freedom be then? Well spoken. It really relates to this podcast because, if we just take our freedom for granted and we're looking for a life of just ease and comfort, I tell you, Benjamin Franklin said we deserve neither. We have to stand up, and we also have to count the cost, but we also need to just go back to how was this nation founded? I mean, the pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower, they came over here for the spreading of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They made a covenant. They fled persecution in Europe. And do you think God's just going to let this country that was founded in a covenant just fall apart? No, if we make a stand, He will stand with us. He'll give us the grace. It's a very important time. Let me just go over some of our godly history and how our forefathers trusted in God to give us this wonderful country. July 9th, 1755, there was a young colonel. He was fighting alongside the British in the French and Indian War. They were headed to a fort which would be in modern-day Pittsburgh today. This colonel warned the British, don't go out into this open field like this, or we could end up, it could be disastrous. But the British, who is this young upstart anyhow? Just early 20s, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. So they go marching into this field, surrounded by hills, and trees, and French and Indians were ready for them. The French had Indian snipers that were great marksmen. They said every military officer that's mounted on a horse, make sure you shoot them, and we kill the military officers first. Then there'll be a great massacre. So what happened? They came into the open field, and the French and Indian were in hiding, and they ended up opening fire on them, killed every single military officer. They shot at this young colonel. They actually shot at him 17 times. And yet he would get up on another horse and start riding away, and somehow he just would not fall down. Finally, the Indian sniper who was having some of his other snipers shoot at him said, "Stop shooting. It's not happening." So what happened is word got back to the fort that there was a terrible massacre, and there was. And they thought this young colonel and all his men were dead. 8 days later, he shows up at a fort, Fort Cumberland, and here's what he had to say. First of all, they look at him and they were in total shock. He took his vest off. He was shot at 17 times, and there were 4 bullet holes in his vest, but yet not one bullet hole penetrated his vest. Here's what he said: "I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation. I have only been an instrument in the hands of Providence." Many times back in those days when they talk about Providence, they're talking about God. Well, what happened? The first great awakening that hit the shores of America took place at that time. There was a preacher, probably the best preacher in those days was a preacher by the name of Reverend Samuel Davies. He began to share about this young colonel and God's intervention, and a great awakening took place. First great awakening to hit the shores of America. This story of God's intervention was taught for 150 years in our public schools, until people that wanted to get this out of our public schools, didn't want mention of God, wanted to rid our nation of our Christian heritage. They finally took it out of the history books, and it wasn't taught anymore. But it was in 1770, 15 years later, this warrior chief who was said to be one of the greatest marksmen in the French and Indian War, great sniper. He wanted to meet this young colonel, and here's what he had to say about this young colonel. He ended up, in 15 years later, he met him. And he says, "I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I have come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven, who can never die in battle." That's amazing. And then he went on to say this: "I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven, who can never die in battle, who in one day will lead a great nation." That Indian chief was literally prophesying. Who was that young colonel who feared God and lived for Christ? His name was George Washington. He became the first president of the United States. In fact, when this country was just getting started, he just wanted to, after the war, he just wanted to go back and farm and just retire and live a comfortable life. But they said, if you don't lead this fragile country, it will never exist. It will never take off. Unless you become our leader, it will never happen. And so he ended up taking that responsibility. He didn't do it because he was power hungry. He did it because he was a servant. Many on the left are trying to erase our godly heritage. They're calling people like George Washington and our founders deist. Deist is very similar to agnostic, somebody that says, "Oh, maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't a God, but who cares? It doesn't impact my life." Well, it greatly impacted their lives, their heart for the Lord and their service. And when George Washington took the oath of the office, the first agenda was to go down to St. John's Church and to pray and dedicate this nation to the Lord. In fact, it's the same, by the way, it's the same chapel, or I could be getting it mixed up, either St. Paul's or St. John's, but it's right where the Twin Towers were. And when 9/11 took place and those buildings came down, that's one chapel that stood. That's where George Washington and those who worked with him dedicated this country to God. They made a covenant. And talk about a great president. You know, if you take a look at those signers and what they had to go through, a battle ensued. They knew that when they signed that document, many of them, it could cost them their life or their livelihood. Life was not going to be comfortable for them anymore. But they were willing to pay the price, not because they were oppressors, not because they were terrorists, like so many on the left spew lies about these. They were servants, they were humble. In August of 1776, it was the heart, they were in the midst of the Revolutionary War. It was the battle for Long Island. What happened is our army, our military was greatly outnumbered by the British. It was the greatest empire, the greatest army in the world at that time, the British, and nobody could really stand against them. What had happened in the Battle of Long Island is they were surrounded. They were surrounded, and there was no escape to try to get out on the water. The British had ships coming up behind them. There was absolutely no escape. But then all of a sudden a storm took place and the British ships couldn't come in. And before evening, Washington and many of his men were able to get out and get to safety. They wanted him to be safe. But many of the army was left behind at that time. So the next morning, the British said, well, we'll finish the job. They could have finished it that night, but they decided, oh, they're surrounded, there's no escape. And so they were going to finish them off the next morning. And what had happened is Benjamin Tallmadge, Major, he was there and saw firsthand how the Lord intervened for our fragile country. Right as the sun came up, all of a sudden, a thick, dark fog began to set in where they could hardly see their hand in front of them. What happened is it gave the rest of the Continental Army a way to escape and flee the British. I mean, our country, this is the kind of things that happen. A short time later, the Continental Army, George Washington and his men had suffered so much and had such little provision. The odds were stacked against them. They had to go on another mission, and that was when we see the crossing of the Delaware at Christmas time. And Washington told many of these men, you guys, you can go back. You've served your country well. You've sacrificed more than enough. If you're wanting to turn back at this time, nobody's going to look down on you and frown on you. Feel free. You can go. But they knew that they had to cross the Delaware and they had to make this attack or the war was over. What had happened is most of the men decided, you know what, we're staying with. We don't care if this cost us our lives or if we have to shed our blood. So they crossed the Delaware, and you see the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware. There was ice on the river at that time. They were crossing over, and all of us that night, a storm came in that was so bad, hailstorm, snowstorm, that this Hessian mercenaries that were on the other side guarding that area, they decided to take cover. It was Christmas night too, and like a good German, they like drinking. And so they were drinking a lot that night, and when this storm hit, they all decided to take shelter. By the time George Washington's men and him they arrived, there was nobody there to resist them. They wondered, where did they go? They were all laying in bed, drunk, and within 45 minutes, that war was over, and it was a turning point for our great nation at that time. This is the kind of things that happened, and we need to never forget our godly heritage and how odds were against us, just like the children of Israel, but yet God intervened. It was awful time at Valley Forge during the Revolutionary War. Many of the men were dying, not just, they were dying from disease. Things were really rough. And you see that picture of George Washington going out, a famous painting. I love that painting. He went out with his horse into the woods and kneeled. Somebody caught him kneeling and praying and calling out to heaven. I want to tell you, agnostic, deist, they're not given to intense prayer and intercession like George Washington was. But he was praying for our country, asking for God's intervention. It was at Valley Forge that Washington, one night, he retired early and wanted to be left alone. Told those that were with him to leave him alone at that time, and just wanted to get away. He went into his tent, and an angel appeared to him. And this is recorded in the Library of Congress, but how many people even know about it? It's in the Library of Congress. An angel appeared to George Washington and shared with him 3 great perils that will take place in America. The first peril that the angel showed him was the Revolutionary War. Showed him how that they would overcome in the Revolutionary War. The second peril he showed him was exactly what happened in the Civil War. And then the angel told him the third peril will be by far the most dangerous, the most perilous time for this country. And he began to describe what happened during that time when this angel was telling him about the third peril. I just want to read part of it from one of our magazines here. The third, being the most dangerous, is what is taking place in America right now. In the third peril, Washington saw a dark cloud come over the land with a dark red light, causing cities and villages to be burned. It looked like all hope was lost until a trumpet sounded. Instantly, a light of 1,000 suns shone from above America, pierced and broke the fragments of the dark cloud which enveloped America. Things began to turn around, and our nation was spared once again. In fact, the Union was saved, and we are living in that time right now where this third peril is taking place. It's not something we can just sit back and take lightly and say whatever will be will be. Let's be uninvolved with politics. Let's just pray. I mean, whoever God happens to put in, no big deal. You know, we're going to talk. Our next podcast is going to be very important. We're kind of you could say we're getting set up for this next podcast. This next podcast, I'm going to talk about one of the most dangerous things eroding our country and our freedom. Rhinos. Republican in name only. We have a lot of Christians. The Bible tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:12, know those who labor amongst you. And it's talking about Christian leaders. We need to know them. But we also know Christians very slack when it comes to this. Even pastors and leaders, we have no idea who in our local elections who we're going and voting for. We might know 1 or 2 people because, they've come and attended our church. But, this person seems like a nice person. Let's vote for them. Bible says, know those who labor amongst you. And I want to tell you, what's destroying our country is Christians uninvolved with politics, uninvolved with government, thinking, we just need to separate the spiritual and just be censored, focused on the spiritual realm and not these physical things. But the 2 realms are connected as one. I talk about this in my book, The Influence of Greek Philosophy on Western Christianity, how it's so dangerous when we separate the spiritual realm and the physical realms. The 2 are connected as one. How will heaven invade our society if we're uninvolved and we're just focused only on spiritual things? We have to be focused on spiritual things. The spiritual realm does have preeminence over the physical realm, but if we're not putting the 2 together as one, it leads to the destruction of nations, and we're watching it play out right before our very eyes. But know those who labor amongst you. Get involved. Got some great books on our godly heritage. America's Godly Heritage. I love David Barton. He's got some excellent books out. I would highly recommend, and we'll put some links at the bottom with some of his excellent historical books. You can go to wallbuilders.com. I have a book out called The Damaging Effect of the Religious Spirit in Politics. I wrote right before the 2016 election to get Christians off the fence, get them involved in shaping government. And we saw some great things happen at that time because a lot of Christians decided to get involved and get off the fence and care for our country. And so I hope you can tune in. And one of the things I want to close with, Washington had this angelic encounter at Valley Forge, and it turned out, it was inspiration for George Washington to know that heaven's behind him, heaven's behind what they're doing, and that the Union would be saved. Each time they overcame one of the dangerous perils, the angel would say how the Union would be saved and how God would protect the Union. And so we're at a place right now. The beginning of the year, I was traveling and I had a conference I was speaking at down in Phoenix, Arizona, and we had some ministry down in Arizona beginning of the year. Woke up in the middle of the night, and the Holy Spirit spoke this very strongly to me. And he wanted me to change my message. I had a message prepared for this conference in Phoenix, and he said, I want you to talk about how the angelic realm will be more active in 2022. Look at 2 Chronicles 20, verse 22, if you get a chance. It talks about the angels coming as ambushments against the enemy armies that outnumbered Judah. We're living in a time where the angelic presence of heaven is much more active. I just got back from India, and Jesus was appearing in our outreaches. Even before we arrived in these places, these remote, unreached places, and angels were appearing. People were getting set free from demons, miracles, healing, signs and wonders, brain tumors dissolving, blind eyes open, cripples being healed, bone cancer, a young boy that was 2 years suffering with bone cancer and just looked awful when we were praying for him. The next morning, his mother in tears testifying how he was feeling so much better, and he was able to stand and tell us how much better he was feeling. But many encounters, as I've been sharing about the angelic realm picking up in 2022, what's been happening is the Lord's been backing up that word and confirming it. And I believe, if you look in the Bible, when persecution picked up and odds were against the church or against Israel, there was many times angelic activity. God bless you. Hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Share this with your friends. We're going to be uploading this on Telegram. Rumble is one of the best places to find us. We will be doing some things on YouTube, Facebook, but we can have, as you know, that there's heavy censoring of conservatives on these platforms. Another way to find us is go to our website, markandersonministries.com. But take the time, if you were blessed by this podcast, share it with at least 10 other friends. Let's spread this and get this word out. Let's get Christians activated for the upcoming elections, and let's keep freedom rolling. There's a price to pay, and we can, with God's grace, we can do it. God bless.
In the words of Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. We must contend for truth. If we don't contend for truth, we lose our freedom. Benjamin Franklin said those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. You've been watching Contending for the Nation with Mark Anderson. If you've enjoyed this podcast, share it with others and spread the truth. For more information about today's show and contending for freedom, go to markandersonministries.com and find the truth.